a random draw. 2022 Overseas TV Viewers Survey. We look forward to hearing from you.
Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea's central bank raises its key policy interest rate by a quarter percentage point, bringing it to a 14-year high of 3.5%. This comes as part of continued efforts to fight inflation, but the finance ministry expresses concerns about an economic slowdown for 8 straight months. The police's probe into last Halloween's deadly crowd crush in Seoul comes to an end after more than 70 days of investigation. More than 20 government officials were referred to the prosecution, but amid criticism from politicians. President Joe Biden reaffirms the ironclad South Korea-U.S. alliance. This as he commemorates the 120th anniversary of Korean emigration when the first group of Korean immigrants reached Honolulu, Hawaii. Good evening. It's 9 p.m. here in Korea, and thanks for joining us on Arirang News. We start with another rate hike here in the nation. South Korea's central bank raised the benchmark interest rate by a quarter percentage point to 3.5% as it continues to fight inflation. Our economic correspondent Kim Hyun-sung starts us off.
The highest benchmark rate in more than 14 years. The Bank of Korea on Friday announced a raise of the base interest rate to 3.5%, a hike of 25 basis points. This is the central bank's 7th rate hike in a row, the longest consecutive set of rate raises ever. From last year to this Friday, the bank has raised rates by 250 basis points in total. But the central bank may not pivot anytime soon as it desperately tries to bring down inflation.
Before we're sure that prices are headed towards our expected levels, it's too early to discuss bringing down rates.
The governor forecast on-year inflation rates to come down to the 3% range by the end of this year. That's quite a step down from current rates, which have been running at 5% or higher for the past 8 months. But that's still not enough to hit the BOK's target rate, a healthy 2% inflation. The country is also facing weak growth. In 2 weeks, the quarterly GDP growth rate for the last 3 months of 2022 will be announced. The BOK governor worries that this report may bear some bad news.
The spread of COVID in China, the semiconductor industry looking weak, and the Itaewon crowd crush. These reasons, as well as economic indices not looking good for the fourth quarter, mean there's a high chance of negative growth.
Another curveball to South Korea's economy is the Federal Reserve's future rate hikes. U.S. interest rates are currently in the 4% to 4.25% range. But some experts forecast that the Fed could raise rates to 5% or higher. When the Fed raises rates, it may be in the interest of South Korea to follow suit, as a big wedge between the two numbers could drive foreign investors out of South Korea and bring down the Korean currency.
The Monetary Policy Committee had to start the new year with some tough decisions as they face an economy weighed down by sluggish growth and price inflation. With some committee members suggesting more rate hikes to come, Friday's rate hike may not be the last we see this year. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
Financial authorities expect Korea's economic slowdown to continue into this year. The main factors, they say, are shrinking exports and a sluggish recovery in domestic consumption. Our financial correspondent Itaewon explains further.
The South Korean economy is likely to keep slowing down in the new year, according to a report Friday from the Finance Ministry. It said the recovery in domestic consumption is slowing down, exports are shrinking, and inflation is likely to remain high. This forecast is more negative than last month's. The phrase concerns over an economic slowdown has now appeared in the report for 8 months in a row.
Monetary tightening and COVID-19 in China are creating greater uncertainties. Slower growth in major countries and the war in Ukraine are also creating risks.
The ministry said one of the main factors is exports. South Korea's exports last month dropped 9.5% compared to the same period a year earlier, down for a third month in a row. This resulted in a ninth straight monthly trade deficit. So far this month, as of Tuesday, the deficit with China is more than $1.8 billion.
The trade deficit with China is expected to continue due to sluggish exports of semiconductors. Demand for semiconductor equipment is dropping there, which will eventually lead to a drop in South Korea's exports. Exchange rates are also contributing.
Consumer prices in December were up 5% on year. Inflation has been steadily coming down since it reached its peak in July, largely due to a drop in the price of gasoline. But still, inflation's been above 5% since last May. The recovery in domestic consumption is also weakening. In November last year, production in the service sector dropped 0.6% on month, while retail sales also fell 1.8%. Meanwhile, the Bank of Korea on Friday predicted economic growth for this year to come in below 1.7%. It also said it expects consumer inflation to slow down to the mid-3% range. Itaewon, Arirang News.
Now to the U.S. The impact of the Federal Reserve's aggressive rate hikes appears to be taking shape there. Figures for December show inflation slowing down. Yoon-jin has more.
The U.S. Department of Labor said on Thursday that the U.S. Consumer Price Index rose 6.5% in December on year. It has been shrinking for 6 months in a row since peaking at 9.1% in June and is now at its lowest level in 14 months. The index also dropped 0.1% on month, the first on-month drop since May 2020 at the beginning of the COVID-19 global pandemic. The measure of core inflation, which strips out volatile food and energy prices, rose 0.3% from the previous month, which translates to a 5.7% annual pace. This figure is regarded as the best indicator for the trajectory of inflation. Policymakers continue to consider interest rate hikes and whether they're needed to tame inflation. And the latest signs of cooling inflation may allow the Federal Reserve to slow down the pace of its interest rate hikes. This comes as a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, with hopes that it could ease the financial burden for American households with the rising cost of living, and hopes that the economy could avoid a dreaded recession this year. 이은진, Arirang News.
By the end of the decade, it's expected that 30% of South Korean companies will be using artificial intelligence. Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy opened a committee Friday on the digital transformation and announced strategies to internalize AI in industries. Currently, only 1.6% of firms in the manufacturing industry use AI, and the ministry said the digital transformation is proceeding slowly. The government will inject 1 billion won, or about $800 million, into each of 5 AI-related projects this year and expand the budget for these areas next year. Also, it plans to nurture more than 100 globally competitive companies that can supply AI technology. Today, police wrapped up its 73-day-long special investigation into the Itaewon crowd crush. The team referred nearly 24 officials to the prosecution on charges of professional negligence and others. But there are critical voices within the parliament. Our National Assembly correspondent Lee Si-hoo tells us why.
The special unit of the police investigating last year's deadly crowd crush in Seoul wrapped up its 73-day-long investigation on Friday. The 501-person team probed a total of 538 people and collected some 140,000 pieces of evidence. In a briefing at its Seoul office, the team said the main causes of the tragedy were a lack of preventive safety measures and a failure by the responsible authorities to respond properly. The team referred a total of 23 officials to the prosecution on suspicion of professional negligence resulting in death. 6 of them have been detained, including the head of the Yongsan-gu District Office, Park Ki-young, and former Yongsan Police Station Chief Lee Im-jae. The 17 others referred to prosecutors but not detained include the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency Chief Kim Kang-ho and Yongsan Fire Station Chief Choi Sang-bum. The investigative team determined, however, that top officials, including Seoul Mayor Oh Se-hun, National Police Chief Yoon Hee-gun, and Interior Minister Lee Sang-min, did not have a legal duty of care with respect to the incident and were therefore not investigated. The main opposition party has objected to this, saying the highest authorities have evaded responsibility and only those below them have been charged. Opposition lawmakers on Parliament's committee investigating the Itaewon crowd crush have called for a probe by a special counsel.
We thought this would happen, but this disparity in treatment is unacceptable. That's why we are asking for an investigation by a special counsel.
The ruling People Power Party said the outcome of the investigation is valid because those not charged in the incident were never legally responsible for it to begin with.
This would only be a disparity if the people in question were in a position of legal responsibility. Criminal punishment can only be handed down based on strict evidence and criteria. Is that not so?
The prosecution will now further investigate those referred to it for potential indictment and trial. Lee Si-hu, Arirang News.
The upcoming Lunar New Year holiday will be the first since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic to be free of social distancing. Seollal, as it's known in Korean, is one of the nation's biggest traditional holidays, and this year will run January 21st to the 24th. This year, there'll be no ban on visits to nursing homes or on dining in at restaurants at highway rest stops. Through the holiday, the government will continue to operate COVID-19 testing centers. And in fact, PCR tests will be available for free at 6 highway rest stops across the country. Meanwhile, the health authorities are due to meet with experts next Tuesday to discuss whether to end the rule on indoor mask wearing. The top diplomats of South Korea and Japan spoke on the phone Friday about bilateral matters, including Japan's subjection of Koreans to forced labor during World War II. Seoul's Foreign Ministry said Foreign Minister Park Jin and his Japanese counterpart Yoshimasa Hayashi agreed to keep communicating to improve relations and resolve bilateral issues. They also discussed the situation on the Korean Peninsula and decided to continue strengthening cooperation to counter North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. Friday's phone call came a day after the South Korean government revealed a plan to compensate the victims of forced labor through a public foundation instead of the Japanese firms that were responsible for it, which has sparked controversy within the country. The international community is renewing its calls on North Korea to return to the negotiating table over its aggressive ambitions. Our Kim Jong-sil has more on the recent remarks by the head of the United Nations.
The UN chief aimed strong words at North Korea during a Security Council meeting on Thursday as he pressed Kim Jong-un to return to dialogue.
The onus is on the DPRK to comply with its international obligations and return to the negotiation table.
He said the unlawful nuclear weapons program being pursued by the regime is a clear and present danger, driving risks and geopolitical tensions to new heights. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, criticized China and Russia, saying they're protecting and abetting Pyongyang, which grossly disregards their international obligations.
China and Russia repeatedly stopped the Security Council from condemning the DPRK's unlawful actions in 2022.
According to Reuters, North Korea's mission to the UN did not respond to a request for comment on Guterres' remarks, while China's UN ambassador Zhang Jun also distanced himself from giving a response. Last year, China said the key to solving the issue of nuclear provocations from North Korea was in the hands of the U.S., urging Washington to show, quote, sincerity and flexibility moving forward. Meanwhile, at another event on Thursday, a White House official forecasted a grim outlook for relations with Pyongyang. Deputy Assistant to the U.S. President and Coordinator for the Indo-Pacific, Kurt Campbell, said North Korea at this point appears to be disinterested in diplomacy, not only with the U.S., but also with South Korea and Japan. South Korean ambassador to the U.S. Cho Tae-yong also urged North Korea to engage in dialogue with no strings attached, saying the regime can still choose a future for its economic development. Kim Jong-sil, Arirang News.
Now turning to the war in Ukraine. Earlier this week, Poland vowed to send German-manufactured Leopard battle tanks to Ukraine. Regarding that, Germany's vice chancellor says that Berlin will not stand in the way of other countries' decisions to support Ukraine. Shin Ha-young reports. Germany has signaled that it does not have any intention to block other countries from sending weapons to Ukraine. It came a day after Poland announced that it would send Ukraine a company of German-manufactured Leopard 2 battle tanks. Polish President Duda said it would send the tanks in a meeting in Lviv on Wednesday with Ukrainian President Zelensky, who welcomed the decision. Hinting at Poland's plan, Germany's vice chancellor suggested Thursday that Berlin should not hinder other countries that are planning to provide military equipment to Ukraine.
There's a difference between making a decision for oneself and preventing the decision of others. And I believe that's still true, and accordingly, Germany should not stand in the way if other countries make decisions to support Ukraine, independently of what decision Germany makes.
It would be the first time since the start of the war that a Western-made tank will be sent to Ukraine. The Leopard 2 tank, one of the most heavily armored main battle tanks in the world, is equipped with a 120mm smoothbore gun. It is made in Germany, which has sold the tank to more than a dozen countries. Its re-exports, however, would need the approval of the German government. After announcing its plan, the Polish president cautioned in a press conference that a whole range of formal requirements, approvals, and so on must also be met. Ukraine has been asking Western countries for Leopard tanks, but Germany has instead recently decided to send armored vehicles to Ukraine by the spring. Meanwhile, Western defense officials will meet at the Ramstein military base in Germany on January 20th to discuss expanding military support for Ukraine. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News. U.S. President Joe Biden has reaffirmed Seoul and Washington's ironclad alliance, marking the 120th anniversary of Korean-American Day. According to a White House statement on Thursday, Biden looked back on the day 102 Koreans arrived in Hawaii 120 years ago and paid respect for the contributions made by the Korean community to his country. Biden also stressed that the Seoul-Washington alliance has become stronger and more lively than ever following his state visit to South Korea last May. Then voiced his hope for moving forward with South Korea using the Korean phrase 같이 갑시다, meaning let's go together. Today, January 13th, marks the 120th anniversary of Korean emigration. 120 years ago today, the first group of Korean immigrants arrived in Honolulu, Hawaii. Since then, we've seen an exponential growth in the number of overseas Koreans across the globe. Our Song Yu-jin guides us through the history of Korean emigration.
January 13th, 1903. The RMS Gaelic arrives in Honolulu, Hawaii at dawn. The first emigration ship carrying Koreans. How and why did they make that journey?
So this is where it all started, Incheon Port, also known as Jaemupo Port, back in the early 1900s. And this was actually the country's largest port where more than half of its trade took place. But during this time, Koreans suffer from great political turmoil and also food shortages. And so from here, looking to support their families and seeking for a better life, 121 Korean immigrants boarded the Genkai Maru on December 22nd, 1902, and set sail for Hawaii.
The ship arrived in Nagasaki, Japan 2 days later. There, only 102 who passed physical examinations got on board the Gaelic. After arriving in Hawaii, most worked at sugar plantations for over 10 hours a day, providing relatively cheap labor. Following the first voyage, some 7,400 Koreans moved to the U.S. over the next 2 years. But this was only the start.
Koreans started new lives as independence activists in China, farm workers in Mexico, theatre actors in Russia, miners and nurses in Germany. Their destinations diversified, especially after the Emigration Act in 1962.
Currently, there are more than 7.3 million overseas Koreans across 193 countries. And now there are those who are working to continue this legacy. One is film director Lee Jin-young.
After living here for several years, I got to learn about this amazing Korean immigrant history, which was so very inspiring and very moving at the same time. I wanted my daughter and their friends to know how much love they have received, not just from their parents, but from ancestors.
There's also Korean-American Julia Ryu, who rose to stardom after her Korean folktale-based musical Simcheong went viral online.
I have so much more of an appreciation of the really hard work and difficult times that our grandparents went through in order to give their children and their grandchildren a better life, and I hope to be able to pass on that legacy.
Though spread across the globe, one thing will never change. We're all Koreans by heart. 송유진, Arirang News.
K-pop girl group Blackpink has been nominated for this year's Brit Awards in the category of International Group of the Year, becoming the first K-pop girl group to be nominated at the awards. The group's agency said Friday that Blackpink will be competing with some of the biggest names in the pop music industry, including Drake and 21 Savage. Artists are nominated by a panel of radio and TV DJs and executives in the broadcasting and music industries. This year's winners will be announced on February 11th. Boy band BTS was the first Korean act to be nominated at the Brit Awards for the International Group of the Year award for 2 consecutive years in 2021 and 2022, but did not win. Neonatal jaundice is said to be common in newborns, and researchers in Korea have come up with a way to treat it with a textile-based wearable patch that uses a blue OLED device. Jung Eun-ju explains.
Jaundice in newborn babies is a common condition. Jaundice causes yellowing of the skin due to the buildup of a pigment in the blood called bilirubin. Jaundice symptoms normally pass on their own but are often treated through phototherapy to prevent complications. A blue light with a special wavelength is shined on the skin so bilirubin can be broken down by the kidneys. Phototherapy, however, requires the baby to wear an eye patch in an incubator to protect their eyesight from the strong light. The babies also have to be isolated from their parents for more than a day. A South Korean research team has developed a wearable OLED fabric that emits a blue light of 470 nanometers, which is effective in treating jaundice. The fabric is flexible and can even be washed with water.
After coating the fabric that's actually used in making clothes with a material that can flatten it, an OLED is produced by stacking various organic layers, including electrodes, onto it.
The fabric works with the low voltage of one small battery and can treat jaundice even if its light intensity is reduced to 1/10 of existing treatment devices. After shining the newly developed OLED on neonatal serums, the research team confirmed that bilirubin levels dropped to treated levels within 3 hours. This means that newborn jaundice could be treated by simply wearing clothes made from this fabric.
Existing technology needs installation, so is limited by time and space. The developed OLED has the same effect as existing devices, but can be made into wearable baby clothes.
The research team is preparing clinical trials of the newly developed wearable blue OLED and expects to commercialize it within 2 years. Jung Eun-ju, Arirang News.
For this entire weekend, a mix of rain and snows in the forecast nationwide. As for the readings, maximum temperatures will keep dropping from this point on. By Sunday, daytime highs will return to the seasonal average at 3 degrees in Seoul. Snow clouds will be heavily clustered across eastern parts of the country. Substantial amount of snowfall is in store for mountainous regions of Gangwon-do province with up to 70 centimeters. Parts of the east coast will also see heavy snowfall of up to 40. Other regions, including Seoul, will see relatively less with about 1 to 3 centimeters. This round of snowfall will last until next Monday, and frost and ice may appear on the roads for the time being, so please drive with extra caution. Tomorrow, Seoul and Daejeon will be starting off at 7 degrees. Daytime highs will be in the similar range. Seoul will get up to 8 degrees, Gwangju 11, Busan will be reaching 12 degrees Celsius. After the snow tapers off, minus figures will make a return next week. That's all for now, and here are the weather conditions around the world.
That's it for this Friday night's newscast. Thank you for staying with us. Have a great weekend and take care.
백섬에